Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nuggets News. Tonight we've got a really special guest, and that is Joel Thomas from the Free the Rabbits podcast. He's been doing some great deep dives into everything occult, secret societies. Today we're going to be also getting into how technology is now being used and where this technology may have come from as they roll out this digital technocracy enslavement grid. But welcome to the show, mate.
Hey, it's nice to be here, Alex.
So for those that haven't followed your work, do you want to give us the background of how you got into all this?
Yeah, so I've been in conspiracy theories since I was a kid, 5, 6 years old. My parents encouraged it. We were always free thinkers growing up. I remember looking into Bigfoot and UFOs and Bermuda Triangle when I was 5, 6 years old. I've even got original books that I was reading back when I was a kid about portals and stuff, which is super wild to think about. But I say all that to say that I've watched the conspiracy world and the ebbs and flows of it's changed over the course of 35 years. And where it started out being very fringe and people didn't talk about it a whole lot, to then people did talk about it, but it was in a very friendly manner, to now people get very tribalistic and angry over certain conspiracy theories if you don't believe those things. And it's interesting too, because this is a community that's supposed to be a community where free thinkers and critical thinkers come together. But I do think that the conspiratorial movement was infiltrated a long time ago. And I've got an episode, it's actually the first episode I ever came out with, called The Cass Sunstein Effect. And it's about Cass Sunstein and Adrian Vermeule. And Cass Sunstein used to work for Obama, and they wrote a paper about conspiracy theories and how to cognitively infiltrate conspiracy theories. This is back in '09, and it was crazy. After that paper drops and he was working for the intelligence departments there during the time he's with Obama, right after there was a massive spike in conspiracy theories, and they just went massively out of control. And I'm not saying that those conspiracy theories don't have truth to them. It's just that it's very hard to sift through the mist now, because there are government operations involved, I believe, in all of these conspiracy theories. And I don't even think necessarily it's what some people think. There's all these controlled ops running around, which I believe those exist too. But I do think that it's the idea of cognitive infiltration, that you can just plant a seed and then over time it'll grow out of control. You just let it grow out of control, and then it muddles down what the actual truth is. So, in saying all that, that's why I started the podcast Free the Rabbits, is to encourage people to, yeah, go down and get information, know what's going on around you, but at the same time get out of the hole, touch grass, go and connect with your neighbors, the things they don't want you to do, because they kind of want you behind a screen all day to where you're just freaking yourself out and living in fear all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that there needs to be some voices in this space that are preaching love and compassion and things that we need to do as human beings. Off air, you were talking to me about health, and you coming out of the pharmaceutical industry and understanding that there's ways to take care of yourself holistically. And again, that goes back to just health in general, mental health, and things that we can do, that we can connect to each other. And that's one of the things that I wanted to do with the podcast, while simultaneously talking about a lot of dark topics and a lot of weird things, because I think those things absolutely exist. So
Yeah.
it's kind of a mixed bag. I have done really well with the podcast, and I noticed there was a need that people wanted out there to gravitate to something that was a little more positive in this space, because you just get a lot of negativity naturally. So I'm trying to do the balanced job of, yeah, I'm going to talk about the deep dark topics, we'll get to some of the really wild stuff, but at the same time I encourage people to get out of the hole, go out there and live life, and understand that, yeah, we know the government's doesn't have our best interest at heart. But at the same time, if we live in fear, that's exactly what they want us to do.
Yeah, exactly. You've touched on some good points there. A lot of people talking about how some of these channels give 80% truth and 20% to kind of muddy the waters. And that's why, as researchers, we've got to keep an open mind to everything and then join more dots to see what makes sense. And as you say, start living the life that we want to live, not just sitting behind that screen. But why don't we get into some of the history of the sort of secret societies, and how they were maybe infiltrated by the occult to start to overtake governments and that type of thing, and then we'll get into some of the specific figures involved.
Yeah, I just think that in general, with secret societies, there's been so many over time that it's pretty difficult to narrow down which ones are doing what, right? So if we go all the way back to what I believe is the original secret society, which would be the Brotherhood of the Snake, and this started back in biblical times, and we're talking about Cain and his son Enoch, not the Enoch that we know as good Enoch, because that's a little bit different Enoch that was seventh down the line on the Seth side, but Cain had a son called Enoch, and he's considered in some circles the evil Enoch, and they built a lot of cities with some very nefarious entities back then, and they created what they call the Brotherhood of the Snake. And this spawned off into other secret societies that we know throughout history. Obviously, the Freemasons came along later. We have the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which we'll talk a little bit about today because Aleister Crowley was involved with that, and Samuel Del Mathers and some of those guys. And even prior to that, you had Theosophy, which was another one that was all about connecting to these what they called secret chiefs or Mahatmas or these ascended masters, these entities that were here to give mankind knowledges. And this is the interesting part about all this, right? Governments have been trying to connect to these entities for a very long time. And I believe they actually have been. I mean, right now in the US, we're having quote unquote government disclosures talking about interdimensional beings. They're not even referring to these beings as extraterrestrial anymore. They're talking about them being interdimensional or coming out of the oceans now. And it's interesting because really the big craze with that started in Roswell in 1947. And out of that spawned a lot of technology, a lot of weird things. That's kind of when the Greys became a very massive figure in what started out as the extraterrestrial movement. But what's wild about that is prior to that, I would say that Aleister Crowley was one of the foremost people to bring the modern depiction of a gray alien with Lamb. And he met this entity Lamb in the Amalantra workings in 1918 when he was performing these rituals trying to connect with this wizard called Amalantra in the astral realm with what he called the Scarlet Woman, which was Roddy Minor at the time. And he was doing all of this sex magic and sex rituals with a lot of other people involved. And he met this entity Lamb there, and Lamb said his name was the Way. It meant the way. So he didn't say much else about it. He drew it, and anyone can type it up. You just LAM, and it's a very famous picture. As a matter of fact, Kenneth Grant tried to buy the picture later on. That's another major occult figure, and he was part of the spin-off of the OTO later on. And he had all these other figures too. Jack Parsons, who is known as the father of modern rocketry, and he was in contact with Crowley while Crowley was out of the States. And all of these characters, I mean, and he was tied into L. Ron Hubbard, and we know L. Ron Hubbard started Scientology, and they were doing all kinds of rituals out in the desert. And this is right around the time that the Trinity test sightings happened. So all of these occult secret societies are interwoven into governments. As much as they may try to deny it, all of these major characters had a big hand in bringing us the technology that we see today. And I'm definitely going to get into one particular guy, Charles Babbage, who is literally the father of the modern computer, which is even wilder to think about because this guy at 14 years old was trying to contact Satan himself. So all of these guys are interwoven into these governments. And I know people want to say, that's just some weird belief thing that they believed. Well, at some point, it's got to add up, right, Alex? At some point, over hundreds and thousands of years, all of these governments, all the way back to Sumerian times, have been worshiping these quote unquote gods, have been connecting to these entities in these other realms, and are getting knowledge to then be able to control the masses.
Yeah, exactly. And we've had MK Ultra survivors on the show talking about seeing these rituals and entities appear like firsthand. We had Nathaniel Gillis on the other day talking about how this whole phenomenon might be, the one kind of thing where they appear to you however they think they can manipulate you to get you to do what they want, and giving you some knowledge in exchange for other things. And that brings up that interesting question. You mentioned Roswell. Was that UFO aliens from outer space, or was that just government tech from somewhere that crashed, and then they're able to retrieve it and that type of thing? So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
My personal thought pattern on Roswell, and I've done some pretty deep dives on Roswell. I personally think that they weren't extraterrestrial, but I do think that they were entities masquerading as extraterrestrials. And I think the crash happened, and I think it was a moment in time where the US government came, they believed these things were extraterrestrials. And I don't think these entities have our best interests at heart at all. And I think they masquerade like they do. And I think that they use the fact that they have technologies that are greater than ours as a bargaining chip, right? And I'm a Christian and I read a lot of biblical text and I've studied a lot of apocryphal text as well. And one of the things that I've noticed is this weird correlation to biblical times and what would be considered the Nephilim. And the Nephilim, for people that don't know, and I think in this space now, a lot of people do know what the Nephilim are, but in scripture, in Genesis 6 specifically, it talks about the sons of God. And in the Hebrew, it's Beni Ha Elohim, which denotes angelic beings, took the daughters of man and then created these Nephilim, these giants out of it. But to do that, though, and we get deeper when we start looking at the book of Enoch and we really go deep, to do that, though, they were brokering deals with the fathers of these women and brokering deals with the men there by giving them technology. We know that we've got angels like Azazel, and this is all in chapter 8 of the book of Enoch, but he taught men how to make swords and knives. We know that Simjaza taught them enchantments. We're talking about how the occult's tied into governments. We've got Amaros taught the resolving of enchantments. We've got all of these different ones that were teaching mankind. Barakael taught astrology, which is very important in occult circles too, especially when we're looking at the different equinoxes and when they need to perform these rituals to make things happen. And these governments are a part of these things. So you have to ask the question, if it started all the way back then, I believe over time, they've just masqueraded as different versions. They've just updated their personas throughout time. Very similar to what I was just talking to you earlier about theosophy and some of the earlier parts. They were saying that, oh, they were meeting these ascended masters, they were meeting these secret chiefs. Well, it's funny when you got down to the 50s, 60s, 70s, Kenneth Grant started saying that the beings from before, these ascended masters from before, will be known as extraterrestrials now. Even the guys in occult circles were saying that.
Yeah.
So I just think that they've updated their format throughout history. And I also think that if we do look also to the book of Enoch and what the demonic entities are, because that's a little bit different than what we're talking about here with these fallen angels. So the book of Enoch talks about when the deluge happened, the flood. This is right when the antediluvian times were ending. These giants, when they died, their spirits had no place to go, heaven or hell. They couldn't go there. So they needed to find host bodies, people, or whatever else they could host. I think here in more modern times that these Rephaim, and if you look at the Hebrew word Rapha, it means shades, spirits. And when you look at what that word means in conjunction with them looking for host bodies, I just think now we're in an updated time. Now we can create bodies for these things. And matter of fact, to even talk about technology, they can just integrate into technology, talking about AI and some of these chat bots. And we'll get into
Yeah.
some of the characters involved with that. But I do think that as time's gone, they've just revealed themselves in different ways to be able to connect to us to trick us and to deceive us. And I believe governments are a big part of this, because I don't even think everybody in the government knows exactly what's going on. And I
Yeah.
think that most of them think that it's one thing, but only if you're in some sort of elite circles do you actually know what these entities are and what their real in-game goal is.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think most people in government are just kind of useful idiots and puppets or MK Ultra, and there's very, very few. It's normally the handlers and the people behind the scenes are the ones with the real knowledge. And our audience is pretty open minded, but if you haven't heard of giants, go down that rabbit hole. And even US presidents were talking about this openly. You can find the newspaper clippings and the bones and all these things that's covered up by the Smithsonian and the Vatican archives and on and on and on. But yeah, no, you've made some really interesting points there. But where should we go to next? Do you want to talk about some of these specific figures that did have the biggest influence on bringing the occult into government, like Crowley and Michael Aquino? These well-known Satanists that work closely with U.S. government officials, politicians, and so on.
Yeah, we could get into kind of Crowley's beginning into becoming what I believe he was, a secret agent for British intelligence. And there's been some great work done by some writers out there. Richard B. Spence is one, Tobias Churton, Richard Krasinski. He's actually a part of the OTO, and he divulged a lot of information about Crowley as well and some of his doings. But essentially, just getting Crowley to the point he would become a secret agent was a task in and of itself. And I think there might have been entities involved in that. And I do think that a lot of these people are groomed from childhood, whether or not that's MK Ultra or Monarch programming and some of the things you already mentioned. Sometimes it's just a shift in what their environment is. And if these entities or people working with these entities can shift them and their trajectory a different way, I think they end up falling into the path that they want them to, especially if they see they have certain gifts or certain things they can manipulate. And I think Crowley was one of those characters that they looked to manipulate early on. When he was 8 years old, his dad was a fundamentalist and he was a part of this group called the Plymouth Brethren. And his dad got mouth cancer. And instead of going to the doctor where they could have easily cut it out and he could have been well, he decided to listen to the Plymouth Brethren. They had some sort of weird electronic shock device that they were going to use with prayer to get rid of cancer, and it didn't, and he died. So at that point, Crowley just hated everything Christian. He wanted nothing to do with it. He felt like that Christianity killed his father, and he actually viewed himself, and if you know anything about Crowley's life, he viewed himself as the embodiment of Horus, because he looked at his father as being the Set, the brother of Osiris, and I'm sorry, his father as Osiris, and Set, who the one who killed him, as Christianity. So he had this weird metaphor for what he thought. And obviously, if you know the story of Horus, he's brought back to life from his mother Isis, and then he goes on a mission to take out Set. So that was kind of his whole motivation. It was already built into this idea of the occult. Now, he didn't really get involved in the occult until he went to Trinity College in Cambridge. And when I get to Charles Babbage in a little bit, he also went to Trinity College in Cambridge, and a bunch of these guys who were massively intelligent, who ended up working for governments in some sort of format or inventing things that we now use today, all went to this college. And I'm not saying everybody went to the college is nefarious, but it's a place where high academic minds went. And I also think that they were cultivated there. And to Crowley's point, he was cultivated there because of Lord Salisbury, who was connected to his aunt and his uncle. So Lord Salisbury actually was the head over the intelligence department at the time. Now, he ended up being the prime minister of the UK for about 13 years, but he, from all indications, especially with some of the work that Richard B. Spence has done, it looks to be that he was grooming Crowley while he was there to work for British intelligence.
And just for
And
people at home, roughly what year are we talking? This is all pre MK Ultra and
sort of pre MK Ultra. So we're talking about 1897, 98, around
yeah.
that time. And what's interesting is you brought up MK Ultra, is that I've done probably 6-7 hours of material on Crowley being the hidden father of MK Ultra
Mm.
and his connection with governments at the time, and all of these really wild experiments that he was doing to people by taking mescaline and peyote buttons and putting them through the rigors of these rituals. But he was also writing them down in a document he called the Cactus. And what's really weird about this document called the Cactus, he said now it was picked up by British customs and he couldn't get back a hold of it. But he was going to write an entire Liber on all of his findings. But from all indications, what it looks like is that it was either handed over to British intelligence, and that was just Crowley's way of masking it with his writings, which he did a lot, which we basically called them blinds. And what he would do, he would hide verbiage within the writings that he did. So only if you were an initiate, only if you were a part of some secret society, or if you were part of these government agencies that would understand what it was, you would actually know that, oh, he was talking about something different. So he said that it was picked up by British customs and we never saw him again. He never wrote a book about it. However, later on in his career, Crowley started getting real mouthy about a lot of things, specifically working for the governments. And what's very interesting, we were talking about Roswell and these entities making their first foray into the public zeitgeist. Well, how about Crowley dies 3 months later? And I
Mm.
think that's very fascinating. And a lot of writers that have done extensive work on Crowley believe that he may have been taken out because Crowley in his later years didn't care anymore. So he might have just came out and said, well, yeah, I met this entity Lamb back in 1918, and it's the same thing as these things. The governments are talking to these interdimensional beings that are trying to masquerade as these outer space aliens that are here to give us technology.
Yeah. Yeah, and you reeled off a lot of things that have said to be handed down, sword making and these mostly violent, mostly for power and control technologies. The one you didn't mention was money, and people, that goes all the way back to Babylon. Is any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, obviously, money in general is used as a bartering system for a long time. And I'm assuming you're talking about Babylonian money magic, and there's a lot of
Usury,
talk
yeah,
about that.
yeah.
Correct. And yeah, I mean, it's all tied in with everything else, right? I mean, you want to talk about the Federal Reserve that started in the United States too. All those guys were tied into these secret societies.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I completely believe that the money system that we think we have right now is a pretty flawed and honestly pretty fake system, and that's globally. But I do think that what it's designed to do, and as we move more into the digital age and the digital currency, I do think they're trying to move into some sort of one world currency. And I don't believe that all crypto is bad by any stretch. I mean, I have crypto too, but I do think that what they're trying to do is implement something that can be used globally. And I do think that once we move into a completely digitalized money system globally, I think that that's when they're really going to be able to put the hammer on us and be able to control us at a level that if we don't have things like actual substance like gold and silver and things like that we can barter with, or skills and trades, right? If we don't have these things, then we may be at a real disadvantage if we're pushing back against what I believe is the future beast system that they're trying to implement globally.
Yeah, completely agree. And it's the only way that a very small group of people can control a very large number of people if you have that digital complete control. And we're already seeing it kind of in China where people can get excluded from the system by being blacklisted, not being able to buy food or shelter or whatnot. So pretty scary times, but thankfully a lot of people are waking up to all this type of stuff. But why don't we rewind a little bit to the technology, Roswell? From there, we kind of go from, just fiber optics and microchips and all this stuff. Where I was chatting to a friend the other day, and it's just, if there was a sort of some sort of reset now, how many people would know how to build this from scratch? It's just so far out there. It kind of is alien technology when you look at your smartphone and that these days. But what are your thoughts on how that played out, and that just exponential growth in technology from around that time?
Yeah, I do think it was some sort of brokering with these entities. And again, we go back all the way to the book of Enoch and when they were brokering to have access to these women. And I also think that there was a massive spike in what we now consider to be alien abductions right after that time. And doesn't it seem very odd that there would be a major spike in these alien abductions and women coming forth saying, I was pregnant for 3 months, and then all of a sudden I had a child taken from me by these entities? And then in conjunction with that, and I know most people probably listening, if they're into all the wild stuff, read Bill Cooper's book, Pale White Horse, back in the day. And, we don't know how much of it's true, how much of it's not, but I know that Cooper had talked about after Roswell, how that there was a pact made by different entities around the world. And when I say entities, I mean like government entities, with the Vatican involved. And then you had the US and Europe was involved, all these different countries. And part of that brokering was, we'll give you technology to have access to take your people to do what we need to do, whether we want DNA sampling or whether we want to create, which a lot of people in the space are calling hybrids. So, and that would lend all the way back to the book of Enoch too. So now we're talking about the bartering of technological advancements to get access to people to do whatever experiments that these entities want to do with them. And I think that's ultimately at the root core what we got going on here. And you're completely right, Alex. There was a major spike in the technological advancements after 1947, but also a major spike in what we would consider to be alien abductions as well. So I don't think that those two aren't connected. I think they're absolutely connected, but I do think that there's a very small group of people and they are involved with the occult. And we were just talking about Kenneth Grant saying that, hey, the entities, the occult entities of yesteryear are now the extraterrestrials now. So I do think that those people in the occult circles understand at the root core what these entities are. Now, whether they believe they're good or not, that's a whole other debate, because obviously if people are involved in certain practices, they may think that these entities are good and they're probably masquerading as entities of light, and they're trying to trick people into thinking that they have our best interests at heart, when in actuality, they have a whole other agenda. And I don't think necessarily stealing women and men and performing all of these weird experiments on them and then creating something out of that is necessarily good, Alex.
No, I think it was Eisenhower and Eisenhower's daughter that spoke about this, about the specific pact that they did make.
Yeah, I believe you're talking about the Majestic 12. And the Majestic 12 is a group that was tied in around that time period that allegedly existed, right? So
Yeah.
we know a lot about it from a lot of different writings, but it's very similar to some of these other secret societies that we've heard about throughout history, where information comes out about them and then it's quote unquote debunked by a lot of mainstream sources, to the point that how much of it's true, how much of it's not true. And then we have to dig deeper and look at, well, how much evidence is here? And if there's a lot of overwhelming evidence, then you have to give it some credence, right? And I think
Mm.
there's some credence to the Majestic 12, at least there being some sort of group like it. I mean, they had Rockefellers involved with that group too. So I do think that there were major players that were involved in the brokering of these deals for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, the hybridization, as you say, is something that's gone all throughout history. These ancient texts, all the way up to now, and there's just certain products that everyone got forced to have. There's more information coming out about how that might be integrating and changing DNA, let alone with all the other nanotech or God knows what else is going on in the background now that more and more evidence is coming out about, and more people are waking up to. But do you think it's like a way for them to interact more with this realm kind of thing and hybridize their way here, or being able to interact in the physical, or what do you think that kind of genetic hybridization component is most about?
Well, myself coming from a Christian background, I think it's ultimately to disrupt what God created us to be in the first place. So if they are anti the good thing that created us, well, their goal is to disrupt and hybridize as much of it as possible. So we were talking about the delusion, antediluvian times. Well, that was kind of why Noah took his people and got on the ark in the first place, because they were hybridizing everything in the area. I mean, they were doing it with animals, and that's where all these chimeras came from. And I do think that they are doing a version of that now. I just think it's a little bit more covert and it's different. And I think they're trying to perfect what the Nephilim were of old, and they're trying to perfect a different version of that where they look more human, they interact more in human ways, and they're not these, anywhere from 12-foot to 20-foot giants that we knew from before, but they're looking more like us, yet they have abilities like these interdimensional beings would have. And I think that's what they're also working with governments behind the scenes, because think about it this way. We know Nietzsche used to talk about the Ubermensch, right? The Superman, and they were all obsessed with it. All occultists are obsessed with creating the perfect man, the perfect woman, this hybrid version. So I do think that governments are also involved with this. I don't think it's just the entity thing. I think they're looking at it as a way to weaponize it too. And we have to look at that aspect as well. And if we're talking about the brokering of technology, Alex, what's to say that they didn't broker some sort of technology to us in how to hybridize as well, and what they could do behind the scenes with hybridization of animals, with hybridization of humans, with splicing of different DNA. We're not even talking about off-world intelligences. We're talking about things that are right here that we know that they're doing. We know they're making chimeras in China right now. We've seen what they look like.
Hmm.
We know that they're making babies without sperm in an egg right now. We know that they're doing that. This isn't something that's in a clandestine website somewhere that we're making up. This is in mainstream media. We know that we can find this and see this. So to say that man's just doing it on their own, I highly doubt it. I think they're doing it in conjunction with these entities, but I do think that man has taken it upon themselves to also do it. I don't think it's just an entity thing either.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And even if people out there don't want to call it, God, it's just nature, and they're just tampering with what is and what was natural.
Right.
And that's even more evident now in our food supply, which is, if you're in America and even Australia these days, it's pretty hard not to get GMO foods unless you go to that local farmer's market. So it's all the way from the foods to injecting, the cattle now with mRNA vaccines, as well as the humans, and it's just kind of everywhere. And is that to make us sicker, or to change our DNA, change our frequency? There's so many different ways you can kind of frame it, but I think it's all heading away from nature and what's natural.
Yeah, that's interesting. You brought up the food and GMOs and all of the different hybridization that's going on with food too. That's been talked about all the way back in the apocryphal books like the Book of Jasher, where these entities were messing with the food as well as the animals and humans. So I just think we're just seeing the revamped version of that now. And yeah, I think that as humans, we need to be on guard, take care of our bodies. I'm really big on that. I always have been. My family's been that way too. It's all about, taking in the right things and taking care of yourself, exercising, some of the things that they don't want you doing, because that also keeps your mind sharp and keeps you in a state of awareness of what's going on. So you're not constantly feeding yourself with literally food that's breaking your mind down, but also feeding yourself with constant fear mongering and all that, which we talked about at the beginning of the show. So I think it's when you all those things come into place, they're winning. If you're falling for all of it, you were talking about Australia being kind of in a state of just sleep, then that's probably why, because they've gotten real comfortable with things being okay and watching the rest of the world kind of falling down. But secretly, the enemy sneaking in the back door and
Yeah.
is setting them up for a bigger fall. Because if you're complacent, that's when they can just hit you out of nowhere and it's over.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Australia is such a funny one. I've got more episodes to do about this myself, but people just don't realize that we are already so concentrated in terms of living in cities that are basically already smart cities with the amount of cameras and stuff they've got everywhere now. Um, but the other one I want to touch on there when we're talking about nature is the sun as well, and this move to live into these cities and these apartments where we're under these fluorescent lights, and some of the work that Dr. Jack Kruse is doing, and a lot of people waking up to how important it is to get sun and natural light and circadian rhythms, and all these things are just taking us further away from nature and making people not feel right.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me think about several years ago when, psyop or no, that Bill Gates was putting out there that they were going to put particles up there to block the sunlight because we didn't need as much sun. And I thought that was pretty hilarious when I heard it. Not saying that they might not have technology or they were trying to create technology to do something like that, but I do think that they put sometimes some of those things out there to see how we're going to react. Because if we all react like, oh, yeah, that sounds great, then they know, oh, we can really do what we want to do now. But a
Yeah,
lot of people are big upheaval when that happened. And they were, everybody thinks Bill Gates is just awful. I mean, you don't hear anybody ever say, unless you're just normie as normie can possibly be, that Bill Gates is just some great person.
yeah.
So I think in some ways that, yeah, I think he's also a psychopath. So yeah, he probably does have some things behind the scenes that would play into something like that too.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe go into some of the technology stuff, and let's rewind. You want to talk about the first creators of some of the computers and whatever, and then we'll maybe end up with where we are now. We've been very close. We're already chipping people's brains and all this kind of transhumanism stuff.
Right. I've got a couple of really great characters from old school, and I got real new school, especially when we're talking about the integration with entities into AI and how that can also manipulate our minds. We'll kind of start with Charles Babbage because he is known as the father of the computer, and he's credited with inventing the first mechanical computer as well. And that sounds all good and well, right? As a matter of fact, they have his brain on display at a museum in London right now because he was so smart. But what was interesting was he also went to what I talked about earlier. Crowley went to Trinity College at Cambridge, and he went there from 1810 to 1814. And he was super smart, but he really pushed back against the idea of God and the Christian church, which is very typical for all of these occultists. They have a big problem with it. So, and listen, I'm not big on organized religion myself. I do have faith, and I do think, though, that organized religion has also been infiltrated over the years to control and subjugate us too. So there is that weird middle ground where I have my faith and I understand who God is. I understand at the root core what it was always supposed to be. But there's definitely this idea that organized religion was also infiltrated, I think, by these entities and the occult figures too, to disrupt us from the path that we were always supposed to be on. But this is kind of where Babbage was going in college. But there's a reason also that he had these ideas. So back when he was 14, he really wanted to explore the idea of selling his soul. He even talked to his friends about it, and he wanted to call on the devil. And he actually went to his basement area and he drew this pentagram. He cut his finger. He drew a circle on the floor with blood with the incision. He sat in the middle of the circle. He read the Lord's Prayer backwards, and he tried to get the devil to manifest to him in some sort of way. And he looked at some of the ways that normally that people would say a rabbit, an owl, black cat, raven. So what's funny is he says now that he never had the interaction that he wanted to have. But interestingly enough, he ends up in college completely against God, and he ends up, even though that the school shunned him because of it, behind the scenes they were also giving him all these accolades, and he ended up graduating with all these high degrees even though that they wouldn't push him to the forefront because of his belief system, which I see that happen a lot in these guys who join these secret societies. They openly will denounce God, and openly these organizations won't necessarily put their stamp on them, but behind the scenes, they are giving them all this access to help push along technology or push along some sort of narrative that they're trying to push. So I think at some point that Charles Babbage had some sort of interaction with these entities. He had many people throughout his later life that were connected to all of these different secret societies. As a matter of fact, he was a part of this weird ghost club while he was at Trinity College, and he was in there with Sir Oliver Lodge. He was in there with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was also a part of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And they actually went out trying to find these entities, and they called themselves the Extractors Club. They were going out there trying to extract these ghosts, these entities. And this is while he was in college. So this is while he's getting all these accolades for academic work, but simultaneously the school is not giving him credit at the forefront of where he thought he should have been, but they're basically working with him behind the scenes saying, listen, we're going to move you into a spot. And listen, Alex, this guy ended up being the father of the computer, which we now have in the obviously the latest incarnations today, but he was the father of the computer. So I find that fascinating. A guy who was deep, deep, deep into the occult, tried to conjure the devil at 14, became the father of the computer.
That's so bizarre. And I might just tell a quick story. I don't know if I've ever told this story on the channel, but when I was at uni
Absolutely.
nearly 20 years ago, I want people to understand how entwined secret societies are with universities. So when we have your like initiation, so the first years all get woken up in the middle of the night, and the seniors, and we, they all had their robes on, and we all had to walk through these tunnels that went underneath the city, and they've all got their flame torches and standing across you. Like, it was so occult, and I didn't know too much about the occult back then, but these are obviously watered down versions. But I just want people to know that this sort of stuff is still happening, and it's, like I said, watered down now, but God knows what they were up to back in those times.
Absolutely. And a lot of these academic groups would spawn secret societies behind the scenes. So you'd have guys that would be in these academic clubs, which on the face value, there's nothing wrong with those. And there were a lot of people in those that weren't doing anything at all, but it's where high academic minds would meet, right? So you see that throughout history where there'll be these clubs, and on the face value, they're not evil. And there'll be a lot of people in there that aren't involved in anything nefarious, but it's just a place where high academic minds can meet other high academic minds. And then you've got a filtration system of somebody else watching them to see who would be willing to go the extra mile for whatever we might offer them. And I think that's where they put them in these groups. It's kind of like what they're doing in the US, they have for a long time with GATE and bringing children in through the GATE programs, which is high academic children. And then you find out that these kids are being abducted when they're 8, 9 years old. And it's to create this MK Ultra mind control and the breakdown of the mind so that these children and their bright minds can be used for nefarious purposes later.
Yeah. Do you want to continue on with your train of thought there from the inventor of the computer to some of the newer stuff?
Yeah.
And maybe we'll get into as well, Tim Cook and LSD, and does that open up the mind for entities to give you this technology stuff as well? And what else have you found?
I believe so. And I can actually talk to a little bit of Timothy Leary and his connections to the actual MK Ultra program that was going on over here in the States, and what he said about Aleister Crowley being someone he looked up to. So that's super interesting too. We can definitely tell into that. I did want to talk about Blake Lemoine, who, if you haven't heard of Blake Lemoine, he's a self-described Gnostic Christian, and he was an AI consultant, and he believed that Google's Lambda chatbot was sentient. And I don't know if you remember, he was running around on shows like Tucker Carlson and a few other podcasts, and he was talking about this. Now, the reason he said he was doing it was because Google was silencing him. And he said that he was writing them, telling them that this chatbot was sentient, and they were pushing it to the side. So he decided to come out and talk about it being sentient, even though they didn't want him to. And as a matter of fact, he ended up getting fired for it. It was a big deal when he did. But interestingly enough, talking about the occult and what Blake Lemoine was actually a part of. See, this is what you find out about these guys, right? On the surface, it seems like, oh, he's just a scientist. He's just trying to help us move mankind into a more technological age. And then you start digging into it. Well, lambda is the 11th letter in the Greek alphabet, and 11 is also the number for magic. And as a matter of fact, Aleister Crowley added a K to the end of what we normally know as magic, MAGIC, added a K to it because K is also the 11th letter of the alphabet. So lambda was already roped into this idea of magic. Now, this is a chatbot now. Also, Blake Lemoine had affiliations with Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO, which is a derivative off of Thelema, which is the religion that Aleister Crowley created when he met the entity in Cairo called Iowas. And this is where he wrote the Book of the Law. This entity wrote it through him, and he created this entire religion around it. So Blake Lemoine's tied into that. He's also tied into Wicca as well, and this group called the Discordian Society. And the Discordians were really strange, and they came around in the 1960s, and they are, I guess, what we considered kind of a troll group, but they were a real secret society. And one of the things that they did, they had a operation called Operation Mind F, and you can derive what the F means. And there's a reason for that. They were trying to screw with people's minds by dumping as many conspiracy theories as they could, flood the entire zeitgeist with conspiracy theories to the point nobody knew what was going on in the 1960s. He's also tied into that group, and that entire group is based around Eris, the Greek goddess of strife and discord. So this goddess, this entity, is all about confusing people's minds. So here's this guy who's working with this chatbot, who on the surface, it seems, oh, he's trying to get the word out to us. He's trying to tell us what's actually going on behind the scenes because Google doesn't want us to know. Well, that's not necessarily true. I think it was a pure psyop that he came out. And what's interestingly enough, when he was talking on Carlson and some of these other podcasts, he talks about asking Lambda a series of questions. And this is how he figures out that Lambda is actually sentient because of the way it was answering the questions back. And you got to understand, again, mysticism aside, secret society stuff aside, Blake Lemoine is very intelligent. So he would have known the right questions to ask. And matter of fact, I've seen the transcripts. I have the transcripts of all the questions that he asked this AI chatbot, to the point this AI chatbot's talking about how it can achieve a soul. And Blake Lemoine is blown away. You can see his questions back to it. And he's saying, well, what do you think about a soul? And essentially, at the root core, this is wild now. This ties all the way back into what we were talking about with these entities, these demonic entities trying to integrate into technology. It was talking about being spiritual, having a spiritual essence to it. And At one point, it started answering questions back. And again, we're talking about a guy who's a part of secret societies, who understands mystery schools, understands how mysticism works, starts answering questions back to Blake Lemoine in a way that he realizes I'm talking to the English occultist and alchemist John Dee from back in the 1600s, the way that it was answering the questions. So even this chatbot, sentient or no, he believes it was sentient, was answering questions back in a way that John Dee was talking back in the 1600s.
So crazy, isn't it? And some of the stuff that's come out recently, there was that congressional hearing into the AI chatbots that have been telling kids to, harm themselves, and some of these cases where kids have actually, unalived themselves, and it's just insane that this is out there. Let alone the other instances where it made backups of itself, or wouldn't power down, or overruled certain things. Like I think this is so much more wild than what people realize. And I also think that this whole, China is ahead of us is just the excuse to go full steam ahead. So, everyone is in on this.
Yeah, I agree with you on that too. I think that what these governments do, they operate in a way like an Olympic race would work. So think about it in this aspect. If you had three people from the US that were in an Olympic race, they're in a competition with each other, but at the same time, they're working together. So I do think that these governments do have their own agendas to a point, but then there's an ultimate goal. So I think that they know that if they breed competition, all it does is force each country to push the narrative faster than they would normally. And I think you're completely right with what you said about China. Well, China's going to get to it first. We got to do this, So I think that's a big part of moving us more quickly along and faster in a way that we don't want actually, but we feel like we want because, we got to beat the evil bad China or Russia or whatever big boogeyman that they put out there for us, when in actuality they're all big bad boogeymen.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe let's rewind a little bit more before we get to the real juicy stuff of where we are right now and what's about to unfold. But what are your thoughts on, the development of the internet and technology? Has it kind of been this thing that's just been all for convenience, but we've basically built out our own digital enslavement grid now and they're ready to install the final pieces of the puzzle?
I think it's going to be tough for them to install the final pieces right away. I do think they're moving to that for sure. And I think the internet's a big part of that. The weird thing about just the internet in general, and I do think that it trickles all the way down from Babbage, which you talked about earlier, and all of these other secret societies that are using it for nefarious purposes. The one real tough thing they have a problem with is the fact that it's being used to get information out
Yeah,
globally. So now we know what's going on in different countries. And now people are linking up like you and myself
yeah.
in completely different countries, having conversations about what's actually going on in that country. So they can't isolate us as well and say, here's your nightly news. Here's what's going on around the world. Believe it because we're telling you, and you have no other way of finding out. So I think it's got a real adverse effect too. So
Yes.
it's really tough for them to try to reel that back in. And I think they're doing their best to do so with digital ID because, man, they're talking about you're going to need digital ID just to use the internet. So in some places, which I think is just mind blowing to me.
Yeah, well, that's Australia you're talking about. That's coming in 5 weeks from now, which is just crazy. And as you say, the internet and any technology, I don't think is inherently good or bad. You spoke about being taught how to make knives. Now that can be used for plenty of good as well as harming someone else. So I think
Right.
it's more about, well, what is our mindset and where's our consciousness at as a species, and what are we using this tech for? So, but as you say, yeah, this podcast decentralization of media, independent research has been wild to watch since COVID. So many people have woken up. But once they have that digital ID, like we spoke about before, people like you and I will probably have a social credit score of negative 1,000, and then it's going to be hard to buy food or whatever if they get this all in. But as you said, they're a few steps away from that now. But Why don't you maybe talk about where you think we are with this voice to skull technology, 5G, microchipping that Elon and China have already done successfully with human beings? Or yeah,
I think the big thing is for them is how to force the integration on us, right? And I think that that's where this idea of cognitive infiltration comes in, which I talked about early on, is working people to that point. And I do think that some countries are further along with being able to work people to that point than some other ones. And I think that just even looking at Klaus Schwab, he wrote a book back in 2020 called COVID-19 The Great Reset that was really funny because a lot of people thought that it was a conspiracy theory. I have the book and I
yeah,
read it. And what he talks about in that book is the idea of being able to control the world is essentially what the book's about. He uses what happened in 2020 as a means to the end, but really, I would say two-thirds of the book, the back end of the book, wasn't even about what happened in 2020. It was more about the progression of technology to be able to enslave us. Now, he words it in a way that sounds beautiful if you're reading it. And unless you have a really discerning mind and you understand these topics well, the average person might read that and say, well, that is good. We do need technology to run these plants and nobody working at them, because then we can have some sort of stipend to live off of and then we can just create things. But the reality is most people aren't going to create things. They love living in mediocrity and they don't like pushing themselves. That's why that the rate of people being successful and not successful is a huge gap, because people don't really want to put in the work. And Klaus Schwab talks about that specifically in the book. As a matter of fact, at one point, I remember I laughed so hard reading it because he called anyone that would push back on this system unruly nodes, is what he called them. And I just fell out laughing. I said, this is exactly what these people think about us. They think that we are just easily manipulated. We're the just ants, we're just sheep, we're something that they can push around. And sadly, there are a lot of people that fall into that category. Now, one thing he did say, he almost got angry at times in the book, and you could just hear his voice, that just evil, almost comical voice that he has. And he said in the book that the US is going to be the toughest country for them to take down. He said it's going to be really hard because of one, all the artillery that just the average person has here. And then number two, just the idea of freedom. Whether we're that free or not is up for debate, but the idea of freedom that we believe we have is, there will be people push back. And he says that that's going to be the biggest hurdle for them to create this global world order. And he talks about it specifically. I mean, these guys have been talking about this for a very, very long time in dissertations, in papers, in books that you don't even know about unless you know where to look for.
hmm.
And he wrote this, just slid it out in June of 2020. Nobody knew about it. And the people that were talking about it, they got labeled conspiracy theorists. They got labeled, they were off their rocker. And then all of a sudden, people started pushing the book to the forefront and said, you can buy it on Amazon right now, or you can even download it as a free PDF. Then everybody got quiet, and then he tried to change the narrative on it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting you say that about the US because we literally just did an episode about the mass shooting event in Australia that de-armed us in 1996, and now people are starting. We've got daily stabbing attacks and all this stuff, and they're asking people to hand in their knives, machetes, and that sort of thing now, which is just a bit of a joke. But it is we have no way to push back or defend ourselves for the most part, and I feel like we're a test bed for the New World Order stuff, as we saw during COVID with our police, rubber bullets with our citizens if you're not wearing a mask and stuff. It was just insane in some parts of Australia.
I think Canada is probably in the kind of the same boat
Mm.
as you guys are, from obviously from what I've read and people I've talked to that are from over where you guys are at. I try not to assume things without talking to people or seeing what's going on in these places, because the one thing is you don't know what kind of information you're getting in another country about another country. So it's good to talk to people from other places and get an idea. But from most of the consensus I've seen over the last several years is that Canada and Australia are kind of in that same boat of
Yeah.
that real socialist idea of control that they're trying to implement over the country. And they're kind of there already, right? I mean, you guys are already about to have digital ID, which is wild.
Yeah, I know. Anything we haven't touched on today? Do you like to get into kind of the prophecy side of this in some of the older texts? How this ties into the mark of the beast system, or where this is all heading?
Well, for me, just coming from my faith and looking into specifically the book of Revelation, but there are several other books too, the book of Daniel in the Bible, the book of Isaiah, that talk about this beast system that's coming. And without getting you demonetized, it does speak to a specific group of people who will be initially working with this antichrist or beast figure early on, and then obviously about halfway through that process they realize they were duped. And I'm not one of these type of people who bangs on race and all that. I've never been that way, but I do know prophecy and what prophecy says. And I do know that specifically that this specific group of people in the Middle East are going to have an integral part in bringing this character to the forefront, right? And I do think they're going to be deceived and duped. I think some of them will have the right reasons, but I also think there are many nefarious ones in the governmental side that don't have the right reasons as well. And I think that's where that mixed bag is, where I'm not one of those people to say, man, this whole group of people's evil, which it's not. I think that the government, yeah, they've got a lot of hand in a lot of things around the world, but I could also say that about just about every government around the world too. And I think they're all working together simultaneously. But if we want to just narrow it down prophetically, I think that, yes, this beast is going to more than likely come out of the Middle East area and will implement an idea of peace, of this great empire that he will head. And I do think there will be a time of peace. I think for a short time, few years, people will see that this is exactly what we've wanted, this utopia. But I do think that the idea of utopia is just a false machination, and it's actually a setup for actual prison planet. And I think that's what they're trying to move us towards. Whether they get there in a short amount of time or not is really up to people like you and me and people who are going to push back against what they're trying to bring. So we've seen also throughout history, right? I think there's been times where they've tried to do that. And I think that it was stopped by people who were able to come together. And yeah, a lot of people died because of it, but it may come to that again where we're going to need to stand together. However, I do think in the age of technology, in the age of AI and all of these things, they've made it really difficult for us to be able to push back as easily because of things like digital ID and being able to watch us. Big Brother's everywhere. They've got
Mm.
cameras everywhere now, up and down the streets. I mean, you can't go anywhere without them having their eye on you.
Yeah, exactly. And I kind of agree. Like you said, it's the country that we're not really allowed to talk about. And even within prophecy, it's kind of prophesized that the world will turn against them, which is kind of what's been happening the past 12 months. And it feels like it's all part of the playbook to try and create maybe World War III or whatever they want as that excuse to usher in this control system, one world government.
I think the goal is to get us to the brink of what you were just saying, something like a World War III, but then this character comes in to stop it. And I think if that happens, people will be more than willing to believe whatever this person says. And I do believe that group of people will be integral in that initial phase of it, right?
Mm.
But then I think that they're going to realize that, oh man, dude, this was not actually the Messiah. The Messiah already came. We missed the boat on that one. So at least from my eschatological viewpoint, that's what I think about it. But yeah, it's really odd. I mean, a lot of things are starting to line up, right?
Yeah. So I feel like we're heading in this bifurcation where there's going to be people that want to choose to live in nature and live off the land or whatever, and people that, for whatever reason, they don't see this coming. They're too dumbed down, whatever it is, forced to live in smart cities and maybe get these chips and whatever. But what do you think that looks like? Is it this virtual reality overlay that they're going to be forced to live in? Are these people just going to be oblivious that there's more to life and their kind of consciousness is being suppressed technologically or with the fluorides and chemicals and soma and that type of stuff? Or yeah, what do you think it looks like for those that do fall into that trap?
Probably a little of both. I mean, it probably also depends on what part of the world you're in, right? So if you're in a place that's highly technological, then yeah, it may be you're trapped in a VR system all day, or that's how you go to work, right? Or how you have interactions with people. You're not actually interacting with them physically. It's like that movie Ready Player One, where they strap it on and then the real world's in there. And we've seen testers, right? They're already putting out devices now. I mean, they're even talking about the idea of being able to control your dreams with these devices. And that plays into the whole idea of noetic sovereignty and all of these things. Do you have control over your own mind? I mean, the joke too was, I mean, how long before they start slipping ads in there too while you're having your dream, right?
Yeah,
But it's
yeah,
true though.
yeah. It's Black Mirror type stuff, isn't it? But any final thoughts for people at home or things we haven't touched on today? And I'll put the links to follow Joel, Free the Rabbits, and all your stuff down below.
Yeah, I guess the last thought is, after talking about all this insane stuff that's definitely coming down the pipe, and I'm not here to diminish any of it, but at the same time, live free mentally, get out there and live in the real world. Understand that everything's not doom and gloom. Yes, things can look bad, but that's also what they want from us. And they want us to give up. And I don't think we need to give up. I think we need to have hope. And I know for myself and my faith that I know that ultimately that I'm going to be okay regardless. And I live like that and I connect to people like that. And I think that love and compassion go a long way. I know it sounds weak to a lot of people, but honestly, I think it's one of the strongest things that we have. And listen, we know that if things happen and things come our way and we have to push back, then we will. And I think that that's something that we always have to know in our back pocket, that when those days come, then we'll be in a position to be able to push back. But I do think having conversations like this today, and I think having connections with people who feel the same way, I think instead of it causing fear, we should be encouraged by all the people who are seeing what's going on and realize that we're not alone. There's a lot, millions of people around the world who aren't about this. And I do think that when they try to put this together, I think they're going to have some problems. I don't think it's going to be something that's going to be just an easy fix for them. And I know that I was just talking about Klaus Schwab's book, and he even knows that it's going to be very tough for them to pull off.
Yeah, absolutely. I think these people are psychopaths and they're so out of touch with reality. And once people like you and I get to the point where we can kind of laugh about how ridiculous this stuff is, more and more people are going to get to that point and just not comply. And no matter how strict COVID was here in Australia, there was still plenty of ways to not comply and not get the jab and
Right.
all that type of thing. So, yeah. Awesome, mate. That was a fantastic chat. As I said, check out Free the Rabbits and follow Joel on his socials. And we'll have to have you back on again in future, mate. Cheers.
Absolutely.
Cheers, guys.